At a family party, my husband said he doesn't want kids with me because I'd be a terrible mother. When I confronted him, he just shrugged and said I should have seen it coming. I used to think that if my marriage ever ended, it would be because of something gradual, years of resentment, small betrayals stacking up, the slow erosion of love. But I was wrong. My marriage unraveled in an instant, in the middle of a crowded family gathering, with my husband's voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "I don't want kids with you, because you'd be a terrible mother." The room fell silent. A few awkward chuckles, as if someone thought it was a joke, but then they saw my face. My heart didn't just sink, it shattered. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't even in the room anymore. Just floating in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It was my sister's engagement party. A warm, cheerful evening filled with clinking glasses and shared memories. My family had always been close, the kind that gathered for every birthday, every milestone. It was the kind of night where the world felt safe, predictable. Until it wasn't. I don't even remember what led up to it. A casual conversation, maybe a relative joking about how my husband and I should be next to have kids. We'd had those discussions before, and I had always believed that we were on the same page, or at least, I thought he had just been hesitant, needing more time. But this wasn't hesitation. This was cruelty wrapped in certainty. His voice was steady, his words calculated. He wasn't just stating a preference. He was making a statement. About me. About how he saw me. About how he had always seen me. My mother gasped audibly. My father's face turned rigid. My sister, the one whose happiness we were supposed to be celebrating, reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it in silent solidarity. And my husband? He just sat there, relaxed, taking a sip of his drink as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my world. I couldn't stay. My chair scraped against the floor as I pushed back, walking blindly toward the nearest exit. The murmur swelled behind me, a mix of disbelief and hushed whispers, but I didn't care. I needed air. I needed distance. I stepped outside, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. My hands were shaking. The evening breeze did nothing to cool the rage building in my chest. What the hell just happened? Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. My mind was a storm of thoughts, of replaying every single moment of our relationship, searching for the signs. They had to be there, right? Warnings I had ignored? A truth I had refused to see? Then, I heard footsteps behind me. He followed me outside, but there was no urgency in his steps, no remorse in his face. Just that same detached expression, like he had simply stated the weather. What the fuck was that? My voice came out raw, almost unrecognizable. He shrugged. You should have seen it coming. I blinked. The wind held in my ears, but nothing was louder than the silence between us. My entire life, my entire future, had just been reduced to a casual shrug. What do you mean, I should have seen it coming? I whispered, each word laced with disbelief. He sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. Come on. We both know you'd be awful at it. You get stressed too easily, you're impatient, you like your space. You always say how tired you are after work. Do you really think you could handle a kid? Every word chipped away at me, layer by layer, until I felt like nothing was left. Not just because of what he was saying, but because he had thought these things for years and never told me. He had made a decision about my worth as a mother without ever giving me a chance. But you never said you didn't want kids, I managed to choke out. You just kept saying you weren't ready. He smirked. Actually smirked. Because I knew you'd freak out if I told you the truth. It was easier this way. Easier. Easier to string me along. Easier to let me build dreams on a foundation of lies. Easier to humiliate me in front of my entire family rather than have an honest conversation. Something inside me snapped. The weight of the moment, the years of trusting someone who had never truly trusted me back, it all collapsed at once. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at the man I had promised to spend my life with, realizing I no longer recognized him. Or maybe, for the first time, I actually did. And that was the moment everything changed. The car ride home felt like a vacuum. We didn't speak. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, and he didn't seem in a hurry to fill the silence either. It was as if the events of the night hadn't even fazed him. He hadn't apologized or even attempted to explain himself. He'd said what he wanted, and now it was as if the conversation was over. But for me, it had just begun. The house felt different as I walked through the front door, cold, empty. It was the same place I had always felt safe, the place where I had imagined us building a future. But now, every corner felt like a reminder of the walls he had put up between us, walls I had never seen. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter. I hadn't even noticed that I was clenching my fists until they started to ache. My mind was racing, rewinding everything, every time we'd talked about kids, every comment he'd made about waiting for the right time, every laugh he'd shared with me about the crazy stories he imagined when we had children. Was any of it real? For the first time, I felt like I didn't know him at all. I tried to call a friend, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? Hey, guess what? My husband just told me I'd be a terrible mother and that he never actually wanted kids with me. How could I make sense of that? How could I make sense of him? And then, the floodgates opened. The memories flooded in, those little moments I had dismissed, thinking they were nothing more than passing frustrations or casual observations. He'd always been quick to point out my stress, my impatience, how I would retreat into myself when life got overwhelming. He'd dismissed my anxieties as overreactions, chalked them up to needing more balance or getting my act together. But now I realized that in his eyes, those were all signs of my inadequacy. Signs that I wasn't good enough to be a mother. A real mother. There had been hints before, of course. His frequent jokes about how I'd make a terrible parent, his disinterest when we talked about parenting, how he always shifted the conversation when it got serious. But I'd brushed it off, telling myself he just needed more time. And now, with one sentence, he had ripped apart everything I had once believed was true. He hadn't needed time. He'd just never wanted it. With me. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about kids. It wasn't about parenting at all. It was about who I was in his eyes. I had spent years believing I was enough for him, that the love we had could withstand anything. But now I saw that, for him, I was always going to fall short. He had never trusted me with the truth. He had never believed in my potential as a partner, as a mother, as a person. Every time he pulled back or avoided the tough conversations, it wasn't because he was unsure, it was because he already knew the answer. It wasn't me. He had written the end of our story long before I ever had the chance to write my own. When I finally found the words to speak, they were quiet, almost too soft for him to hear. Why didn't you tell me this before? Why string me along, make me think everything was fine when all along, you knew? Why not just be honest? He didn't even look at me when he replied, his voice detached, as if we were discussing the weather. I told you everything you needed to hear. I gave you space to make your own decision. My stomach turned. Gave me space? What about my voice? What about the partnership we'd promised? That was when I realized, this wasn't just about kids. This was about a marriage built on lies, built on a foundation of half-truths and silences. Every step of our life together had been calculated, controlled by him, what he thought I wanted, what he thought I needed to hear. I wasn't even sure if the love he claimed to feel for me had ever been real, or if it was just another manipulation to keep me in line, to keep me from seeing the truth. I felt the walls closing in again. But this time, they weren't just the physical ones surrounding me, they were the emotional walls he'd built around us, slowly, invisibly, over years. And now that they were up, I didn't know if I could ever break through them. The lies had infected everything. Every promise we'd made, every shared hope, every dream about our future, it had all been contaminated. How could I go on trusting someone who had so casually dismissed my worth as a person, as a potential mother, with a single sentence? How could I go on pretending nothing had changed when everything had changed? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear, the world I thought I knew, the man I thought I loved, none of it was real anymore. And that, more than anything, was what broke me. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like hours. The air in our house was suffocating, thick with everything that hadn't been said. My mind was spinning, but my body remained frozen, like I was trapped in the aftershock of an earthquake, unable to move, unable to think straight. Finally, he broke the stillness. Are we really going to do this? His voice was flat, emotionless. He didn't seem angry, just tired. Do what? I demanded, the words slipping out before I could stop them. You don't get to drop a bomb like that and then act like it's no big deal. He looked at me, an eyebrow raised in mild amusement, but his eyes were distant, detached. It's no different than any other conversation we've had. You just don't like hearing the truth. I felt the anger rising in my chest, bubbling up uncontrollably. The truth? He had never given me the truth. Not once. He had been telling me what I wanted to hear for years, manipulating every moment to fit his narrative. And now, he expected me to swallow it all as if he had been the honest one all along. The truth? I repeated, my voice trembling. The truth is, you never once had the decency to be honest with me about what you wanted. The truth is, you've been lying to me for years. He shrugged again, the same casual gesture that made my blood boil. I told you what I thought you needed to hear. You never questioned it before, so why are you questioning it now? Because now I see everything clearly, I spat back, feeling the sting of betrayal in my gut. I see that you never saw me. Not really. I wasn't the woman you wanted, I was just the one who fit the role you needed me to fill. You kept me in the dark about everything, about kids, about us, about what you really thought of me. I didn't even know who I was to you. He didn't flinch. There was no apology, no remorse in his eyes. Just that same disinterest, as if the unraveling of our marriage was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Look, he said, his voice colder than before, I didn't come here to argue. You asked for the truth, and that's all I'm giving you. The finality of his words hit me like a punch. I had asked for the truth. But the truth, as it turned out, was a jagged shard I wasn't ready to swallow. And in that moment, it became clear, this wasn't just about kids or betrayal. It was about something much deeper, something I hadn't wanted to see before. I had been living in a relationship where he had always been the one in control, where his desires, his needs, had shaped everything, my dreams, my choices, my future. And I had let it happen. I had been too afraid to see it, too afraid to question it. But now, with the cold truth laid bare, I had no choice. I couldn't unsee what he had just shown me. I couldn't pretend anymore. I looked at him, the man I had promised my life to, and for the first time in years, I didn't recognize him. The man I thought I knew was a stranger, someone who had never trusted me enough to be honest, someone who had never truly loved me. And that was the hardest part, the realization that I wasn't the one who had changed. He had. And now, I had to face the truth, there was no going back. The house felt even emptier now. Each step I took echoed like a warning, a reminder that everything was about to change. I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened, that I could just pick up where we left off. Not after what he had said, not after how coldly he had laid it all out. He was still sitting there, arms crossed, the same indifferent expression on his face. He didn't seem surprised by the weight of what was happening. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He wasn't even asking me to stay. He had already made up his mind about us, and in his eyes, this was just another conversation that had gone as expected. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but I could feel the tears threatening to spill. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want him to see me break down. But it wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most. It was the realization that he had never truly loved me in the way I had loved him. He had never seen me the way I had seen him. And that was a wound I wasn't sure I could heal from. Is this really it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Is this how it ends? No fight, no regret, no second chance? He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, as if contemplating whether it was even worth responding. And then, finally, he spoke. If you need to go, then go. But don't act surprised by this. I've been telling you, in my own way, for years. You just never heard me. I stared at him, trying to find the man I had once loved, the man I had shared my life with. But all I saw now was a stranger who had been hiding behind a mask of indifference, a stranger who had been careful with his words only so he wouldn't lose control. The love I thought we had was just a mirage. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. The truth was out, and so was my decision. I don't want this anymore, I said, my voice firm despite the ache in my chest. I can't be with someone who doesn't believe in me, who never even tried to understand me. His eyes flickered with something, maybe it was surprise, maybe regret, but it was gone before I could be sure. Then go, he said again, his voice softer, but still detached. You've already made up your mind. I grabbed my things in silence, every step feeling heavier than the last. There was no dramatic moment, no grand gesture. Just the slow realization that I was walking away from everything I had known. The man I had married. The life I had imagined. The future I thought we would share. All of it was gone in a heartbeat. As I reached the door, I took one last look at the life we had built together. It wasn't much to look at anymore. A house that was now just a shell, empty of the dreams I had once placed inside it. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just walking away from him. I was walking away from a version of myself I didn't recognize anymore, the woman who had clung to hope, who had trusted blindly, who had loved without question. But I was also walking toward something new. A future I hadn't seen until now, a future where I could trust myself again, where I could rebuild, and where I could decide what came next. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was free.